This is an important story because it actually just demonstrates how propaganda gets recycled, used by the people of power, and everybody hands each other. So there was an interesting story in the New York Times on the front page of the paper yesterday. Let's put this up there on the screen. The title, "Factory Jobs Are Booming Like It's the 1970s." Subquote, U.S. manufacturing is experiencing a rebound. Companies are adding workers amid high consumer demand for products. Now, the lead of this story makes it seem like there's some major transformation of the U.S. economy. He said, quote, "Ever since American manufacturing entered a long stretch of automation, every recession has led to losses. But the recovery has been different. American manufacturers have now added enough jobs to regain all that they shed, and then some." So when he says that factory jobs are booming, really what they're saying, Krystal, is after the artificial recession of 2020 induced by COVID lockdowns, that all of the jobs that were artificially lost as a result of lockdown are now back to pre-pandemic levels. Now, it's not a boom if you revert to the baseline. That would be like saying that we've been booming because gas prices are back to 2019 levels. It's like, no, that's the goal. That's what you want, is in order to normalize post-crisis. So they write this whole long story. And by the way, that's a fine story too. That you could use the headline, "Factory Jobs Return to 2020 Levels." Everyone would be like, okay, well, that's not though what they're claiming. They're claiming
not some massive remaking.
Yes, they
of
are
the
claiming
economy.
that the spike that we see, if you cut it off at the right point, is the same as a boom of U.S. manufacturing since the 1970s. Now, they correctly point out that the reason that factory jobs, quote unquote, are coming back after the artificial recession of 2020 is, yes, consumer demand exists, supply chain problems, all of that. But to cast it as some sort of massive transformation of the U.S. economy is just completely incorrect. And yet, this is being seized on by the administration and pushed out as propaganda for how they're like the greatest people to ever hold the Oval Office. White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain immediately, let's put this up there, quote, he says of the story, "Not an accident, not happenstance, the consequence of a Biden-Harris economic plan with, quote, made in America at its heart." Now, look, again, you could claim we recovered, we're doing well, we have more ground to make, but again, the story and the way it's cast just completely belie the facts on the ground. And our friend Jeff Stein, in a bit of a subtweet, put this out, and I won't speak on his behalf. I'll just say this. This is all he tweeted. He tweeted out the actual U.S. manufacturing graph since the 1970s. I mean, for those who are just listening, you can see that from 1940 to 2020 that we have seen a massive drop-off from the 1970s to 1980s period. Now compare the boom, for those who are watching, of the precipitous increase from the 1970 baseline to where things ended in the 1980s. And then take a look, once again, at how we have just re-normalized to a 2020 baseline after the terrible year of the COVID pandemic. It's just plain as day to describe like some sort of, quote, boom, when in reality, the precipitous drop from 1980 to 2020, or to 2022, remains the real manufacturing story. I just don't think you can describe this as anything else than complete propaganda, Krystal.
Oh,
for the White House,
absolutely.
on behalf of the New York Times,
Yeah,
like basically rewriting
really
economic
shameless.
history. It's just wrong. It's a wrong story.
There's a lot you could look into with this graph too. I mean,
Oh, that graph is a story of America.
It really is. The way that it falls off a cliff after PNTR.
Yeah, well, for those who don't know, PNTR is permanent normal trade relations with China. Basically allowed, lowered tariffs on China, allowed Chinese entry into the WTO, and effectively destroyed the American manufacturing industry, all industry, especially cars and several others.
Yep, and I mean, it's not the only story. There's also is the story of automation, where you need fewer workers to do the amount of work. Like that's part of it. NAFTA and these trade deals are another part of it. But when you look at this graph, that year 2000 really does seem to stand out in terms of the massive decimation of the factories of America. And then, that leads to, then you've got the financial crash that creates another massive drop off in the graph here. And then lo and behold, you get, Trumpism, and you get like a lot of chaos in our political system. And, anyone looking like neutral observer looking from the outside, it's pretty clear what happened here. But yeah, to paint the return of the factory jobs that had just like gone away during the pandemic as some sort of massive reimagining of the economy is just really quite farcical. The Biden administration has done a few things that I think will overall be beneficial. I think, you know, provisions that they put into place of like the government has to, they sort of hardened some of the rules about the government having to buy products that are made in America. There are some provisions, I think, in the Inflation Reduction Act that might be useful. The CHIPS Act, certainly specifically with regards to semiconductors, hopefully is going to pay off and be useful. But to claim mission accomplished victory here is really quite something. And for the New York Times to frame it in this way as like booming like the 1970s, well, in the 1970s, you had, look, thousands of persons. So there, it's up at 19 and now it's down at 13. I mean, this is, it's quite something. Quite something.
I mean, look, you could, again, say we've come back to baseline. You could say a lot of things. We also know, like, if this happened under Trump, it'd be like, economy returns to some, it's just complete BS. They could have reported the entire story without the frame that they needed to overreach, and ultimately, that's what they did. Anybody who knows, you know, anybody who can read a chart knows that it's completely farcical and ridiculous. But I thought it was important that we pointed out, A, because the discussion of why manufacturing dropped in the US and where we actually are is a very important story. I would love for us to boom like the 1970s and go all the way back up. That would require like $1 trillion investment, completely rechanging our trade laws, changing our foreign policy. Like, there's so much that it would need.
Real industrial policy on a nationwide scale, not just specific to one little industry.
Exactly.
We are like barely dipping our toes in any of that at this point.
100% correct.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.